The gunshot cracked through the twilight air like thunder, sending a flock of startled birds skyward as Margaret Whitley ducked behind the overturned wagon. Her heart pounded wildly against her ribs as she clutched the leather-bound journal to her chest, the only thing she'd managed to salvage from the wreckage of her life. The bandits who had ambushed her stagecoach lay motionless in the dust, felled by the mysterious marksman who had appeared from nowhere, like an avenging angel in worn leather chaps and a sweat-stained hat. "Madam," a deep voice called from beyond her shelter. "Are you hurt?" Margaret peered cautiously around the splintered wood, her blonde hair falling in disarray around her dirt-smudged face. The tall figure approached slowly, rifle held loosely at his side, the dying sunlight of 1876 New Mexico territory casting his features in sharp relief. His eyes, blue as a summer sky, met hers with concern. "I believe I'm unharmed," she managed, her Boston accent sounding painfully out of place in this rugged wilderness. The stranger holstered his weapon and extended a calloused hand. "Colton Reed, these parts ain't safe for a lady traveling alone." Margaret hesitated before accepting his help, his strong grip pulling her to her feet with surprising gentleness. "Margaret Whitley, I wasn't planning to be alone. My arrangements have gone terribly awry." Colton Reed surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency: the dead driver, the scattered luggage, the now useless stagecoach with its broken axle. "Where were you headed?" "Silver Creek. I was to meet my fiancé." Her voice caught. "Former fiancé, I should say." Something in her tone made Colton glance sharply at her face. "Former." Margaret clutched the journal tighter. "I received this at our last stop. A letter explaining he's married another. Apparently, he found waiting for an Eastern bride too burdensome." The cowboy's expression darkened. "Some men don't deserve the air they breathe." He turned toward his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion waiting patiently nearby. "Silver Creek's 2 days' ride from here. My ranch is closer. You can rest there tonight, and I'll see you safely to town tomorrow." Margaret straightened her spine, years of finishing school instilling proper decorum, even in disaster. "I couldn't possibly impose, madam," Colton interrupted gently. "Nightfall's coming, and these hills crawl with worse things than the sorry excuses for men I just dispatched. You need shelter, food, and safe passage. I'm offering all three." Their eyes locked in silent assessment, her desperate circumstances against his unexpected gallantry. Finally, Margaret nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." "Folks just call me Colt," he replied, gathering her meager belongings. As he secured them to his saddle, Margaret caught him studying her with an unreadable expression. "Ever ridden before?" "Not since I was a girl," she admitted. He nodded once, then surprised her by saying, "I reckon you'll remember quick enough. Life out here has a way of making you remember who you really are." With practiced ease, Colton helped Margaret onto his horse before swinging up behind her. The closeness of a stranger would normally have scandalized her, but nothing about this day remained within the boundaries of propriety. "Hold tight," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as his arms encircled her to take the reins. As they rode away from the scene of devastation, Margaret felt something shift inside her, a door closing on the life she'd planned, another opening to a future she couldn't begin to imagine. The vastness of the New Mexico sky stretched endlessly above them, painted with streaks of crimson and gold as the sun sank toward the horizon. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. Colton's voice rumbled close behind her. "Most folks only see the danger out here. Takes special eyes to see the beauty, too." Margaret turned slightly, catching the profile of the man who had saved her life, the strong jaw dusted with stubble, the lines etched around his eyes by sun and hardship. A man nothing like the refined Boston gentleman she'd known all her life. "How far is your ranch?" she asked. "About 3 hours' ride. We'll be there before full dark." He adjusted his hold on the reins. "Hope you don't mind. but I live alone. My housekeeper, Mrs. Flores, comes by days, but she's gone home by now. You have no family? A shadow passed over his features. Not anymore. The simple words carried such weight that Margaret dared not press further. Instead, she settled into the rhythm of the horse's gait, gradually relaxing against the solid presence behind her as they traversed the rugged landscape. True to his word, they crested a ridge just as twilight deepened, revealing a sprawling ranch nestled in a verdant valley below. A two-story house of weathered wood stood proudly amid several outbuildings, a corral filled with horses, and pastures dotted with cattle. "Welcome to Whispering Pines Ranch," Colton said, a note of pride in his voice. Margaret took in the scene with widening eyes. "It's far larger than I expected. Been building it up for 8 years now." He guided the horse down the slope. Started with nothing but 20 acres and a broken-down cabin. Now it's one of the most successful spreads in the territory. As they approached, a dog came bounding from the direction of the House of Black and White Border Collie, who circled the horse with excited barks. "That's Bandit," Colton explained. "Best cattle dog in 3 counties." They dismounted in front of the main house, Margaret's legs trembling from the unaccustomed riding. Colton steadied her with a hand at her elbow, the touch brief, but reassuring. "Let me show you inside while I light the lamps," he offered, retrieving her small carpet bag from the saddle. The interior of the house surprised Margaret with its unexpected refinement. Though rustic, the furniture was solid and well-crafted, the floors covered with colorful woven rugs, and the walls adorned with landscapes in simple frames. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes. "You have quite a library," she remarked, running her finger along the spines. Colton struck a match to light an oil lamp. "Winter nights get long out here. Reading helps pass the time." The golden glow revealed more details: a piano in the corner, photographs on the mantel, curtains at the windows that softened the masculine atmosphere. "This doesn't seem like the home of a man who lives alone," Margaret observed. Colton's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "It wasn't always." He set her bag down. "You must be hungry. I can fix something simple." "Please let me help," Margaret insisted, following him to the kitchen. "I may be from Boston, but I'm not entirely helpless." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Never thought you were, Miss Whitley." They worked together to prepare a meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. In the small kitchen, Margaret became acutely aware of Colton's presence, the breadth of his shoulders as he moved about, the grace with which his large hands performed even mundane tasks. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of society men, but something about his weathered features and direct gaze held an undeniable appeal. Over dinner, she learned more about Whispering Pines and the surrounding territory. Colton spoke knowledgeably about cattle breeding, water rights, and the challenges of ranching in such unforgiving terrain. He asked polite questions about Boston but seemed more interested in why she had agreed to marry a man she'd never met. "It wasn't entirely sight unseen," Margaret explained, cradling her coffee cup. "We exchanged letters for nearly a year. Charles Brookfield seemed intelligent, ambitious, a man building something meaningful in this new territory." Charles Brookfield. Colton's expression darkened. "The banker in Silver Creek?" Margaret nodded. "You know him?" "By reputation." His tone made it clear the reputation wasn't favorable. "I suppose I've had a fortunate escape, then," she said with forced lightness. "More fortunate than you know." Colton's gaze was steady. "But it leaves you in a difficult position." The reality of her situation crashed over Margaret anew. She was alone in a strange territory, thousands of miles from home, with no prospects and dwindling funds. "Yes, it does." "What will you do now?" Margaret set down her cup with determination. "Find employment, I suppose. I'm educated. I taught at a girls' school in Boston before this venture." Perhaps Silver Creek needs a teacher. They do, Colton confirmed. Lost their schoolmarm to marriage last spring. A spark of hope kindled in Margaret's chest. Then perhaps this journey wasn't entirely in vain. After dinner, Colton showed her to a bedroom at the top of the stairs, a surprisingly feminine space, with a quilt-covered bed and lace curtains. "This was my sister's room," he explained, setting a lamp on the dresser. "Everything you need should be here. Bathrooms down the hall." Margaret turned to him, overcome by the day's events and his kindness. "Mr. Reed Colt, I don't know how to thank you properly." His eyes softened in the lamplight. "No need for thanks.
Just get some rest."
Morning comes early around here." As he turned to leave, Margaret impulsively caught his sleeve. "Why did you help me? You could have simply ridden past." Colton considered her question carefully. "Where I come from, you don't leave people in trouble when you have the means to help. Especially not a woman alone." He hesitated. "Besides, something told me you were worth saving." With that enigmatic statement, he bid her good night, leaving Margaret to wonder about the complexities of this man who had rescued her in more ways than one. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with gunshots and faceless bandits. She woke at dawn to the sounds of the ranch coming to life, roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, the murmur of voices below. Washing quickly and donning her travel-wrinkled dress, Margaret ventured downstairs to find Colton in conversation with a plump, middle-aged Mexican woman in the kitchen. There she is," Colton said, turning at her entrance. "Miss Whitley, this is Mrs. Flores, my housekeeper. Mrs. Flores, this is Miss Margaret Whitley from Boston." "Buenos dias, señorita." Mrs. Flores greeted her warmly. "The poor child. Mr. Reed told me what happened. Come. Sit. You must eat." Before Margaret could protest, she found herself seated at the table with a plate of eggs, tortillas, and fragrant coffee placed before her. Colton, already dressed for the day in work clothes, leaned against the counter with his own cup. "I need to check on a sick calf," he explained. "Mrs. Flores will look after you. When I return, we can discuss getting you to Silver Creek." After he left, Mrs. Flores bustled about the kitchen, keeping up a steady stream of conversation that required little response from Margaret. The woman clearly adored her employer, speaking of his kindness and generosity between stories of local gossip and her own family. "Such a good man, Mr. Reed," she said emphatically while kneading dough. "Too long alone, though. Not right for a man like him." "Has he never married?" Margaret asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. Mrs. Flores crossed herself. "There was a tragedy. Not my place to tell. But he deserves happiness, that one." She fixed Margaret with a meaningful look that made her blush. "I'll be leaving for Silver Creek today," Margaret reminded her. "Mr. Reed is merely being kind." The housekeeper shrugged eloquently. "As you say, señorita." After breakfast, Margaret asked to explore the grounds while waiting for Colton's return. The ranch was even more impressive by daylight, a self-contained world of purpose and productivity. Ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully as she passed, their curious glances following her progress across the yard. She found herself drawn to a small fenced garden beside the house, where vegetables and herbs grew in neat rows alongside bright flowers. A wooden bench beneath an apple tree offered a perfect vantage point to observe the activity around her. This was the world Charles Brookfield had described in his letters, the promise of the West with its boundless opportunities and breathtaking beauty. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Margaret from her reverie. Colton appeared around the corner of the house, his hat pushed back on his head, revealing sun-streaked brown hair. "Mrs. Flores said I'd find you here," he said, settling beside her on the bench. "My mother started this garden when my parents first built the house. I've tried to keep it going." "It's lovely," Margaret replied sincerely. "You've created something remarkable here." "We did, my family." A shadow crossed his face. "My father died 6 years ago. Mother followed 2 years later. My sister Clara married and moved to California with her husband. I'm sorry for your losses, Margaret said softly. Colton nodded acknowledgement. What about your family? My parents died in a fire when I was 16. I went to live with my aunt, who provided for my education but made it clear I needed to make my own way in the world. Margaret smoothed her skirt. When Charles's advertisement for a bride appeared in the Boston Herald, my aunt thought it a perfect solution. And you? Margaret met his direct gaze. I wanted adventure. A chance to build something meaningful away from Boston society's constraints. Charles's letters painted such a vivid picture of possibility. The West offers plenty of both adventure and possibility, Colton agreed. But it takes grit to claim them. Do you think I lack grit, Mr. Reed? There was a challenge in her voice. His eyes crinkled slightly. I think you survived a stagecoach robbery that would have broken many Eastern ladies. That suggests a certain fortitude. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Colton spoke again. I've been thinking about your situation. Silver Creek's a 3-day journey from here, and the next stage doesn't pass for another week. Margaret's heart sank. I see. I could take you myself, but I've got business here that can't wait. He hesitated. There's another option. Stay at Whispering Pines until the stage comes. You'd be safe here, and Mrs. Flores would welcome the company. I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition. His gaze was steady. I need someone to help with the ranch accounts, anyway. Been putting it off too long. You said your educated figure you can add columns of numbers better than most of my ranch hands. Margaret recognized the offer for what it was, a way to preserve her dignity while providing assistance. Are your accounts in very bad shape? A smile tugged at his mouth. Terrible. Mrs. Flores threatens to quit every time I ask her to make sense of my ledgers. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Reed. Room and board in exchange for bookkeeping services until the stage arrives. They shook hands formally, though Margaret couldn't help noticing how her smaller hand disappeared completely in his grip, or the unexpected warmth that traveled up her arm at the contact. The next few days established a new rhythm to Margaret's life. Mornings were spent organizing Colton's chaotic accounts in the small study off the main room. The afternoons she devoted to helping Mrs. Flores with household tasks or exploring the ranch property. Evenings brought dinner with Colton, where their conversations gradually deepened beyond ranch business to personal philosophies, favorite books, and childhood memories. Margaret discovered Colton was far more educated than his rough exterior suggested. He'd attended 2 years of university in St. Louis before his father's illness called him home to the ranch. His bookshelves held volumes of history, philosophy, and poetry alongside practical manuals on animal husbandry and agriculture. For his part, Colton seemed increasingly intrigued by Margaret's independence and adaptability. When she correctly diagnosed a sick hen from Mrs. Flores's description, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. My aunt kept chickens, Margaret explained with a shrug. I learned to recognize their ailments. You're full of surprises, Miss Whitley, he remarked. By the 4th day, Margaret had brought order to Colton's financial records, revealing a ranch significantly more profitable than even he had realized. His gratitude was evident as they reviewed the new ledgers after dinner, the lamplight casting a warm glow over the documents spread across the table. You've done in days what would have taken me months, he acknowledged, studying the neat columns of figures. I'm in your debt. Consider it partial repayment for saving my life, Margaret replied lightly. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the atmosphere between them, a recognition of mutual respect evolving into something deeper. Colton cleared his throat and gathered the papers. There's something I'd like to show you tomorrow if you're willing, he said. Best part of the ranch, but it's a fair ride from the house. Margaret's pulse quickened at the invitation. I'd like that very much. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Colton had arranged for Margaret to ride a gentle mare named Daisy and provided her with a spare pair of riding pants that had belonged to his sister. Despite her initial embarrassment at wearing men's clothing, Margaret had to admit the practicality far outweighed the impropriety. They set out after breakfast, riding east across the ranch lands. Colton pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the territory's history: Apache raids, Spanish missions, and the first Anglo settlers who had braved the wilderness. "My grandfather was one of them," he explained as they followed a stream through a stand of cottonwoods. "Came out from Tennessee in '38 with nothing but a wagon and a dream. My grandmother joined him a year later, once he'd built a cabin." "They must have been extraordinarily brave," Margaret observed. "Or foolhardy," Colton added with a grin. "Grandma always said she cried for 3 months straight after arriving. But they built something lasting. That's what matters in the end." After 2 hours' ride, they climbed a steep trail that wound around the base of a red rock formation. As they reached the summit, Colton drew his horse to a halt. "Welcome to Eagle's Rest," he said, gesturing to the panorama before them. Margaret gasped at the vista: a hidden valley nestled between protective mountains, where a crystal-clear lake reflected the sky like a mirror. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in purples, yellows, and blues, while a small waterfall tumbled into the lake from the rocks above. "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen," she breathed. Colton dismounted and helped her down from her horse. "Found it my first year on the ranch. Never shown it to anyone else." The significance of his statement wasn't lost on Margaret. "Why show me?" He looked away, suddenly less assured than she'd ever seen him. "Thought you might appreciate it. Most folks just see land to be used grazing, mining, timber. You see the beauty in things." They spread a blanket near the shore of the lake and shared the lunch. Mrs. Flores had packed cold chicken, cornbread, and apple tarts. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the calls of birds and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. "Have you ever thought of leaving?" Margaret asked eventually. "Seeing other places?" Colton considered the question. "Sometimes. When winter's at its hardest or the drought's killing the cattle. But this land." He trailed off, looking across the valley. "It gets in your blood. Becomes part of who you are." "I understand that now," Margaret said softly. "I've only been here a few days, but already Boston seems like another lifetime." "What will you do in Silver Creek?" Colton's question held an undercurrent of tension. Margaret drew her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "Apply for the teaching position, I suppose. Find a room to rent. Begin again. Alone." "I've been alone since my parents died," she reminded him. "I'm accustomed to it." Colton picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the lake surface. "Being accustomed to something doesn't make it right." Before Margaret could respond, a distant rumble of thunder interrupted their conversation. Colton glanced at the sky, where dark clouds were gathering over the mountains. "Storm's coming. We should head back." They packed quickly, but they'd barely mounted their horses when the first heavy drops began to fall. By the time they reached the trail leading down from Eagle's Rest, the rain had become a downpour, turning the path treacherous with mud. "We'll never make it back to the ranch in this," Colton shouted over the deluge. "There's a line shack about half a mile east. We'll shelter there until it passes." They pushed their horses through the driving rain, Margaret's clothes soaked through within minutes. The line shack, a simple one-room cabin used by ranch hands during cattle drives, appeared through the curtain of water like a miracle. Colton dismounted quickly, leading both horses to a lean-to beside the structure before helping Margaret inside. The interior was sparse, but dry: a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a wool blanket, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. Colton immediately set to work building a fire in the stove while Margaret stood dripping on the plank floor, her teeth chattering from the cold. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Colton said matter-of-factly, his back to her as he coaxed flames from kindling. "There should be some spare shirts in that trunk. They'll be big, but they're dry." Margaret hesitated only briefly before practicality overcame modesty. She found a flannel shirt that reached nearly to her knees and retreated to the far corner of the cabin to change, turning her back to Colton. The relief of dry clothing was immediate, though her hair still hung in wet ropes down her back. When she turned around, Colton had changed as well, into a similar shirt and dry pants from the supplies. He looked up as she approached the stove, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her in his clothing before he quickly averted his gaze. "Storm settled in," he observed, gesturing to the window where rain lashed against the glass. "Might be here a while." The implications of their situation suddenly crystallized for Margaret alone in a remote cabin with a man, wearing his clothing, with night approaching. It was the stuff of ruined reputations and scandalized whispers. Yet strangely, fear was the furthest thing from her mind. In the days she'd spent at Whispering Pines, Colton Reed had proven himself to be a man of integrity and kindness. If anything, the intimacy of their circumstances felt like an inevitability, the natural progression of the connection that had been building between them since the moment he'd found her hiding behind that overturned stagecoach. "Are you warm enough?" he asked, his voice gruff with concern. Margaret nodded, moving closer to the stove's warmth. "Yes, thank you." He busied himself preparing a simple meal from the shack's provisions: beans, coffee, and hardtack softened over the fire. The domestic scene felt oddly right, as if they'd performed this ritual together countless times before. As darkness fell outside, the cabin's interior grew intimate in the glow of the stove and a single lantern. They sat side by side on the edge of the narrow bed, the only comfortable place to eat in the small space. "I'm sorry about this," Colton said, breaking a long silence. "Should have paid more attention to the weather." "I'm not sorry," Margaret replied quietly. "It's been a perfect day." His eyes met hers, surprise giving way to something deeper. Despite being trapped in a line shack during a thunderstorm? Perhaps because of it. Her boldness surprised even herself. Colton set his plate aside, his expression serious. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you about my past." The use of her given name sent a thrill through her.
"I'm listening."
"I was married once." The words came with difficulty. Her name was Sarah. We were childhood sweethearts, married young. She died in childbirth 5 years ago, along with our infant son. Margaret's heart constricted at the pain evident in his voice. "I'm so sorry, Colt. After losing them, I shut everything down. Focused only on the ranch, on building something that would last, even if I had no one to share it with." His hand found hers on the rough blanket. "Until you came along." The simple touch of his fingers against hers felt more significant than any embrace. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I wasn't looking for anything when I found you behind that stagecoach. But these past days..." He struggled to find the words. "You've brought something back to life in me. In this house. I haven't felt this way since Sarah," Margaret finished softly. He nodded, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I know it's too soon. You're still planning to go to Silver Creek, start your teaching position. I respect that. But I wanted you to know." Margaret turned to face him fully, gathering her courage. "What if I didn't go to Silver Creek?" Hope flickered in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I came west looking for purpose, for a chance to build something meaningful. I thought that would be with Charles, but perhaps..." She took a deep breath. Perhaps fate had a different plan. Colton's free hand rose to gently touch her cheek. "Margaret, are you sure? Ranch life is hard, especially for a woman used to city comforts." "I'm not as delicate as I appear, Mr. Reed," she said with a smile. "Besides, I've seen how Mrs. Flores bullies you. Clearly the women around here hold their own." A laugh rumbled from his chest, his face transforming with genuine joy. "That they do." The moment suspended between them, charged with possibility. Then, with exquisite gentleness, Colton leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Margaret answered by moving closer, her hand rising to rest against his chest where she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart. When they finally parted, Colton rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he murmured. "Never thought I'd find someone who could make me feel this way again." "Nor I," Margaret admitted. "Especially not after being abandoned by my intended." "His loss," Colton said firmly. "My gain." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the Humbeline shack, Margaret Whitley found herself at the beginning of an entirely different journey than the one she'd planned, one that promised to be far more fulfilling than she could have imagined. The storm passed during the night, leaving a washed, clean world glistening in the morning sunlight. They rode back to Whispering Pines side by side, the unspoken agreement between them creating a bubble of shared happiness that made even the familiar landscape seem new. "Mrs. Flores took one look at their faces when they entered the kitchen and broke into a wide smile.
"Ah, at last."
"I will make a special dinner to celebrate." Colton laughed, shaking his head. "Nothing gets past you, does it?" "Nothing," the housekeeper agreed smugly. "I have been lighting candles to San Antonio for you too since the señorita arrived." In the days that followed, Margaret and Colton cautiously navigated their new relationship. Though propriety dictated she should move to town immediately, practical considerations and their mutual reluctance to be separated led to a compromise. Margaret would remain at Whispering Pines with Mrs. Flores as chaperone, while Colton courted her properly. The courtship, though condensed by frontier standards, allowed them to learn each other's habits and histories. Margaret discovered Colton's tendency to withdraw into silence when troubled, his unexpected skill at the piano, and his absolute devotion to the land his family had cultivated for generations. He, in turn, delighted in her quick wit, her adaptability to ranch life, and the quiet strength that had brought her thousands of miles from home in search of a new beginning. 3 weeks after the thunderstorm at Eagle's Rest, Colton took Margaret back to the Hidden Valley. This time, a picnic awaited them, a checkered cloth spread beneath the same tree, laden with Mrs. Flores's finest cooking, and a bottle of wine from California. As they finished their meal, Colton grew uncharacteristically nervous, fidgeting with his hat and clearing his throat several times before speaking. "I brought you here for a reason," he finally said. "This place has always represented possibility to me, something beautiful and unexpected in the midst of a harsh land." Margaret's heart began to race as he reached for her hand. "Margaret Whitley, I know we've known each other only a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." His blue eyes, usually so confident, now reflected vulnerability and hope. "I love you. I want to build a life with you here at Whispering Pines." He released her hand briefly to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, a delicate gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "This was my grandmother's," he explained. "She wore it for 52 years of marriage. I'd be honored if you'd wear it as my wife." Tears filled Margaret's eyes as emotions overwhelmed her: joy, certainty, and a bone-deep recognition that this moment, this man, was what she had been seeking all along. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Colton Reed, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly, Colton's expression grew solemn. "I promise to cherish you every day of our lives, to build something lasting with you, to fill Whispering Pines with laughter and family again." He drew her close, his voice rough with emotion against her ear. "I'll make you my wife and the mother of my daughters, Margaret. We'll create the legacy this land deserves." The promise, spoken with such certainty and tenderness, sealed their future as surely as the kiss they shared beneath the big western sky. News of their engagement spread quickly through the territory. Mrs. Flores took particular delight in informing the ladies of Silver Creek, ensuring that Charles Brookfield would know exactly what he had lost. The banker's new wife, it was said, looked distinctly uncomfortable at the news. Margaret wrote to her aunt in Boston, explaining her changed circumstances and inviting her to the wedding. The reply came 3 weeks later, a terse acknowledgement accompanied by a small trunk containing family heirlooms that had belonged to Margaret's mother. "She doesn't approve," Margaret said sadly, running her fingers over a silver hairbrush. "But she still sent your mother's things," Colton pointed out. "That's something." They were married on a perfect autumn day, with the aspen trees turning gold on the mountainsides. The ceremony took place in the garden Margaret had come to love, surrounded by the ranch hands, neighboring families, and the few friends Margaret had made in her short time in the territory. The Reverend Williams from Silver Creek performed the service, his wife serving as Margaret's matron of honor while Colton's foreman stood as best man. Mrs. Flores outdid herself with a feast that would be talked about for years to come, and even arranged for musicians from the Mexican settlement 20 miles away to provide music for dancing afterward. As the sun set over Whispering Pines, casting long shadows across the yard where couples twirled to the lively tunes, Colton led Margaret away from the celebration toward the quiet of the house they would now share as husband and wife. "Happy, Mrs. Reed?" he asked, his arms secure around her waist. Margaret leaned into him, the new weight of her wedding ring a comforting presence on her finger. "Completely. And you? More than I ever thought possible again." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "When I found you behind that stagecoach, I was just trying to do the right thing. Never imagined I was finding my future." "God works in mysterious ways," Margaret quoted softly. "That he does." Colton's expression grew mischievous. "Though I think Mrs. Flores believes she deserves most of the credit." Their laughter mingled in the twilight air as they crossed the threshold of their home, leaving behind the sounds of celebration and stepping into the promise of their shared life. The first year of marriage brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Margaret embraced her role as ranch mistress with determination, learning from Mrs. Flores the intricacies of managing a household in territory where supplies were uncertain and improvisation essential. She established a routine of helping with the ranch accounts each morning, tending to household matters in the afternoon, and joining Colton for rides around the property when weather permitted. Winter descended with unexpected ferocity, trapping them indoors for days at a time. They passed the long evenings reading aloud by the fire, Colton teaching Margaret to play chess, and sharing the intimacies of newly wedded life. In the privacy of their bedroom, Margaret discovered depths of passion she'd never imagined, matched by Colton's tender attentiveness to her pleasure. When spring finally arrived, bringing the busy calving season, Margaret proved her mettle by assisting with difficult births and nursing sickly calves in the barn. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of their boss's Eastern bride, gradually accepted her presence as she demonstrated her willingness to work alongside them when needed. "You've surprised them," Colton remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "Old Hank told me today he'd never seen a lady with such grit." Margaret laughed. High praise indeed from a man of so few words. "He's right, though." Colton took her hand, his expression serious. "You've taken to this life like you were born to it. Not many women could adjust so completely." "I love it here," she said simply. "I love our life together." As summer approached, Margaret began to suspect a new blessing was on its way. Her suspicions were confirmed by Dr. Patterson during his monthly circuit through the territory. "Congratulations, Mrs. Reed," the elderly physician announced after examining her. "You're about 4 months along. Should expect the little one around Thanksgiving." Margaret waited until that evening to share the news with Colton. They had ridden to Eagle's Rest for a picnic, establishing a tradition of monthly visits to the place where they'd first acknowledged their feelings. As they sat beside the lake, Margaret took Colton's hand and placed it gently on her still, flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. Colton's expression transformed from confusion to wonder as her words registered. "A baby? You're certain?" Dr. Patterson confirmed it today. "Due in November." For a moment, Colton remained frozen, his hand still resting on her abdomen. Then, to Margaret's surprise, tears filled his eyes. "Colt, are you all right?" He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion. "After Sarah and the baby died, I never thought I'd have this chance again, to be a father." Margaret covered his hand with hers. "Are you happy about it?" Happy doesn't begin to describe it. He gathered her carefully into his arms. "You've given me back everything I thought was lost, Margaret. A family, a future." The months of pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Colton insisted on hiring an additional ranch hand to take over Margaret's more strenuous duties, despite her protests that she remained perfectly capable. Mrs. Flores devoted herself to knitting tiny garments and sharing superstitions about predicting the baby's gender. "It will be a girl," she declared confidently one afternoon as she helped Margaret arrange baby clothes in the nursery formerly Colton's sister's room. "The way you carry, so high and round. Definitely a girl." "Colton thinks it's a boy," Margaret replied, folding a tiny nightgown. "He's already talking about teaching him to ride." Mrs. Flores snorted. "Men always want sons first. But the good Lord sends what we need, not what we want." As her due date approached, Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to the family Bible Colton had inherited from his parents. She spent hours poring over the names recorded there, generations of Reeds who had built lives in unforgiving lands. "Have you chosen a name yet?" Colton asked one evening, finding her with the Bible open on her lap. "I was thinking Clara Sarah if it's a girl, after your sister and your first wife," Margaret said softly. "Would that be all right?" Colton's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "You do that. Sarah will always be part of your history, part of who you are." Margaret took his hand. "I don't want to erase that. I want our child to know about her, about your son." He knelt beside her chair, overwhelmed by her generosity. "What about a boy's name?" "Michael Colton, after my father and you." "Perfect names for either possibility," Colton agreed, pressing a kiss to her hand. The baby arrived 2 weeks early, in the midst of the first snowfall of the season. Margaret's labor began just after midnight, sending Colton riding through the darkness to fetch Mrs. Flores and the midwife from town. By the time they returned, Margaret's pains were coming rapidly, her face pale with the effort of remaining calm. The hours that followed tested her strength to its limits. Outside, the snow continued to fall, isolating whispering pines in a cocoon of white as life struggled to enter the world within its walls. Colton paced the downstairs like a caged animal, jumping at every sound from above, while Mrs. Flores shuttled between the birthing room and the kitchen, bringing fresh supplies and taking away soiled linens. As dawn broke, casting pink light across the snow-covered landscape, a new cry joined the morning strong, indignant and unmistakably healthy. Colton froze in the middle of the parlor, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited. Finally, Mrs. Flores appeared at the top of the stairs, her round face wreathed in smiles. "Mr. Reed, come meet your daughter." Colton took the stairs 2 at a time, his legs nearly buckling with relief. In the bedroom, Margaret reclined against fresh pillows, exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he entered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "She's perfect," Margaret whispered as he approached. "Come see." With trembling hands, Colton accepted the swaddled infant. A shock of dark hair crowned a tiny face with Margaret's delicate features, and when the baby briefly opened them, his own blue eyes. "Clara Sarah Reed," he murmured, awestruck by the miniature perfection of his daughter. "Welcome to Whispering Pines." As he returned the baby to Margaret's arms, Colton was struck by the tableau they created: his wife, his child, in the home he had built. The completeness of his happiness in that moment was almost frightening in its intensity. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "For her. For everything." Margaret reached for his hand, drawing him down to sit beside her on the bed. "We're a family now, Colt. Everything I ever wanted." As Clara grew from infant to toddler, life at Whispering Pines established new rhythms around her development. She inherited her father's love of the outdoors and her mother's curiosity, toddling after Colton when he did chores and demanding Margaret read to her for hours on end. By her second birthday, Clara was the undisputed queen of the ranch, adored by the hands who competed for her attention with hand-carved toys and pony rides around the corral. Her dark curls and bright smile charmed everyone she encountered, while her strong will, pure Reed stubbornness, Colton claimed proudly kept her parents constantly on their toes. The summer Clara turned 3, Margaret discovered she was expecting their second child. The news brought joy tinged with anxiety. Her first pregnancy had been relatively easy, but childbirth had been difficult. Dr. Patterson reassured them that second deliveries were typically easier, but Colton remained worried, insisting Margaret rest more than she had during her pregnancy with Clara. "I'm not an invalid," she protested one afternoon when he found her weeding the garden with Clara helping beside her. "Gentle activity is good for me and the baby." Gentle being the key word, Colton replied, lifting Clara onto his shoulders. "Come inside, both of you. Mrs. Flores made lemonade." As they walked toward the house, Clara chattering happily from her perch, Margaret felt a rush of contentment. Their life wasn't perfect. The ranch faced the same challenges of weather, markets, and isolation as any frontier operation, but they had built something precious together. That evening, after Clara was tucked into bed with her favorite story, Colton joined Margaret on the porch swing that had been his wedding gift to her. The summer twilight stretched long and purple across the mountains as fireflies began to twinkle in the garden. "I rode up to the north pasture today," Colton said, his arm around her shoulders. "The grass is better than I've ever seen it. Thinking of expanding the herd next spring." "That's wonderful," Margaret replied, leaning into his embrace. "The ledgers show we could afford it, especially after the prices we got at market last month." "Not bad for an Eastern schoolteacher and a hard-headed cowboy," he teased, his hand coming to rest on her growing belly. "What do you think, little one? Ready to join this crazy family?" As if in response, Margaret felt a decisive kick against his palm. They both laughed, the shared moment of connection with their unborn child strengthening the bond between them. "I was thinking," Margaret said after a comfortable silence, "we should write to your sister Clara. Invite her to visit after the baby comes. It's been nearly 5 years since you've seen her." Colton nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like that. She should meet her niece and namesake. And the new little one." "Do you still want a son?" Margaret asked carefully. "I want a healthy child and a safe delivery for you," he answered honestly. "Boy or girl doesn't matter to me." Margaret turned to study his profile in the fading light. "You've changed since we met, Colton Reed." "How so?" "You're more open, less guarded." She touched his cheek gently. "Happier, I think." He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "That's entirely your doing, Mrs. Reed. You brought life back to this place."
To me.
Their second child, another daughter they named Elizabeth Grace, arrived on a crisp October morning with considerably less drama than her sister. Margaret's labor progressed quickly and without complications, resulting in a robust baby with a shock of red gold hair that had both parents wondering about distant ancestors. Clara, now nearly 4, approached her role as big sister with solemn responsibility, helping Margaret change diapers and singing improvised lullabies when the baby cried. The sisters formed an immediate bond that delighted their parents and promised years of both mischief and companionship ahead. Life settled into a new pattern with 2 children. The ranch continued to prosper under Colton's management and Margaret's careful bookkeeping. They added a schoolroom to the house, where Margaret began teaching Clara her letters and numbers, planning to educate both girls at home until they were old enough for formal schooling in town. Colton's sister visited the following summer, bringing her husband and their son for a month-long stay that filled the house with noise and laughter. The cousins formed an immediate alliance, exploring every corner of the ranch under the watchful eyes of the adults. "You've built something wonderful here," Clara told her brother as they watched the children play in the garden. "I hardly recognized you when we arrived. You're at peace in a way I haven't seen since before Sarah died." "I am," Colton agreed, his gaze finding Margaret across the yard where she sat in the shade with Elizabeth on her lap. "I never expected to find this kind of happiness again." "Sometimes the best blessings are the ones we don't see coming," his sister observed wisely. On the evening before Clara and her family were to depart, the adults gathered on the porch after the children were asleep. The conversation turned to memories of their parents and the early days of Whispering Pines. "Do you remember how Mother always said this land was meant for generations?" Clara asked, sipping her coffee. "She'd be so happy to see her grandchildren running through the same garden she planted." "I think of her every day," Colton admitted, "especially when the girls do something that reminds me of how you were as children." Margaret, listening to the siblings reminisce, felt a deep sense of belonging to this family history that predated her arrival. Though she hadn't known Colton's parents or grandparents, their legacy lived on in the ranch, in their children, and in the values that guided their lives. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Margaret shared her thoughts with Colton. "I was thinking about what Clara said about your mother's vision for generations on this land." "What about it?" Colton asked, turning down the lamp. Margaret smiled in the dimness. "I'm pregnant again." The lamp nearly crashed to the floor as Colton spun to face her. "Margaret, are you certain?" Dr. Patterson confirmed it yesterday when he came to check on Mrs. Torres's rheumatism. "I'm about 2 months along." She laughed at his thunderstruck expression. "You did say you wanted to fill Whispering Pines with family." Colton gathered her carefully into his arms, his joy evident in the trembling of his hands against her back. "I did say that, didn't I? The day I proposed. You said you'd make me your wife and the mother of your daughters," Margaret reminded him. "So far, you've kept your word admirably." "Perhaps this time we'll have a son," Colton mused, his hand finding its familiar place on her still, flat stomach. "Balance things out a bit." "Perhaps," Margaret agreed. "Though I'm rather good at producing daughters." "That you are, Mrs. Reed. That you are." Their third child, born in the verdant spring of 1880, fulfilled Colton's half-joking prediction. Michael Colton Reed arrived with his father's strong features and a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world with undeniable force. Clara, now 5, and Elizabeth, toddling at 18 months, approached their baby brother with a mixture of fascination and mild disappointment that he couldn't immediately join their games. Mrs. Flores, delighted with the addition of a boy to the family, took to carrying Michael around the house while performing her duties, singing Spanish lullabies and declaring him the image of his father. As the children grew, so did Whispering Pines. Colton's careful management and strategic expansions had transformed the ranch into one of the most respected operations in the territory. They added a proper schoolroom wing to the house, where Margaret now taught not only their children but also those of several ranch hands and neighboring families. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Colton surprised Margaret with a trip to San Francisco, their first journey away from the ranch together since their wedding. They left the children in the capable care of Mrs. Flores and Colton's foreman, boarding the train with a mixture of excitement and parental anxiety. "They'll be perfectly fine," Colton reassured her as the train pulled away from the station. Probably won't even notice we're gone, with all the spoiling they'll get. Margaret laughed, recognizing the truth in his words. It's strange to think of being just the two of us again. So much has changed in 10 years. We've changed, Colton agreed, taking her hand. Grown together. The week in San Francisco was a revelation: fine restaurants, theater performances, and the luxury of uninterrupted conversations that didn't revolve around the children or the ranch. They walked arm in arm along the waterfront, marveling at the ships from distant ports and the bustle of a city so different from their quiet life at Whispering Pines. On their last night, dining in the elegant restaurant of their hotel, Colton raised his glass in a toast. To my beautiful wife, who took a chance on a lonely cowboy and created a life more wonderful than he could have imagined. Margaret clinked her glass against his, her eyes bright with emotion. To my husband, who kept every promise he made beside that hidden lake, especially about making me the mother of his daughters. And son, Colton added with a grin. And son, she agreed, her smile matching his. Though I have a feeling our family might not be complete just yet. Colton's eyebrow rose. Margaret Reed, are you trying to tell me something? She laughed, delighting in his expression. Not this time. But I'm only 33, Colt. There's still time if we wanted another child. His hand found hers across the table, his thumb tracing the gold band he'd placed there a decade before. Whatever God grants us, I'll be grateful. But Margaret, you know you've already given me more happiness than any man deserves. The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. As have you, my love. As have you. Their return to Whispering Pines was celebrated with enthusiastic embraces from the children and a welcome home feast prepared by Mrs. Flores. Life quickly resumed its familiar patterns: the seasonal rhythms of the ranch, the daily lessons in the schoolroom, the steady growth of their family enterprise. The following spring brought another blessing: the news that Margaret was indeed expecting their fourth child. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through summer and fall, with the entire family speculating about whether the new arrival would be another boy or a third daughter. On a cold December night in 1882, with snow falling gently outside the windows of Whispering Pines, Margaret gave birth to twin girls. The unexpected arrival of two babies instead of one caused a flurry of excitement throughout the ranch. Colton, who had assisted with the delivery when it became clear the babies wouldn't wait for the midwife to arrive, was overwhelmed with emotion as he helped bring his daughters into the world. "Looks like I'm outnumbered even further," he joked weakly, cradling one tiny infant while Margaret held the other. "4 daughters and 1 son. Are you disappointed?" Margaret asked, watching his face carefully. Colton shook his head, his expression tender as he gazed at the newborn in his arms. "How could I be disappointed by such perfect gifts? Besides, I told you I'd make you the mother of my daughters. Just didn't specify how many." They named the twins Anna Marie and Laura Jane, honoring both their grandmothers. The arrival of 2 babies at once necessitated adjustments throughout the household. Clara, now 7, appointed herself official helper, while Elizabeth and Michael regarded their new sisters with a mixture of curiosity and bewilderment. As the twins grew from infants to toddlers, the Reed household buzzed with constant activity. The older children attended school in town during the week, returning home for weekends filled with chores and adventures around the ranch. The twins, identical in appearance but distinctly different in personality, kept Margaret and Mrs. Flores perpetually busy. By 1885, nearly a decade after Margaret had first arrived at Whispering Pines, the ranch had transformed from a successful cattle operation into a thriving community. Several married ranch hands had built small houses on the property, creating a settlement that included a communal gathering place where Margaret held Sunday services when weather prevented travel to town. Colton, now in his early 40s, had matured into a respected leader in the territory. His advice was sought on matters ranging from water rights to beef prices, and there had been talk of him running for territorial office, an idea he consistently rejected. "My place is here," he told Margaret after declining yet another delegation urging him toward politics. "With you and the children, building what my grandfather started." "You could do good work beyond Whispering Pines," Margaret observed, not disagreeing but ensuring he considered all options. Colton smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with the expression that had become more frequent over their years together. "I'm doing the best work right here. Raising our children, managing this land, supporting our community. What more could any man want?" The answer came one warm evening as they sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Clara, tall and graceful at 10, supervised a game involving Elizabeth, Michael, and the twins. Their laughter floated through the golden light of sunset, a melody that had become the soundtrack of Whispering Pines. "Do you ever think about that day?" Margaret asked softly. "When you found me behind the stagecoach?" Colton's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Often. I thank God for whatever instinct led me to take that trail that day." "It wasn't instinct," Margaret said with certainty. "It was Providence." He nodded, his gaze moving from their children to her face still beautiful to him, perhaps more so for the fine lines that spoke of years of laughter and occasional tears, of nights spent nursing sick children and days worked side by side under the western sun. "Remember what I said to you at Eagle's Rest?" he asked. "The day I proposed?" Margaret's smile held a lifetime of shared memories. "You said many things that day. I promised to make you my wife and the mother of my daughters." He gestured toward their playing children. "Seems I kept that promise." "You did," Margaret agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And I kept mine to help you build something lasting here." As twilight deepened into evening, the children gradually made their way to the porch, settling around their parents in a tableau of familial contentment. Clara leaned against the railing, her dark hair so like her father's falling in waves down her back. Elizabeth curled at Margaret's feet with a book, while Michael sat beside Colton, earnestly discussing the new foal-born that morning. The twins, never still for long, circled the gathering in a game of their own invention. "Time for bed," Margaret announced eventually, met with the expected chorus of protests. As the family moved inside, Colton lingered on the porch, his gaze sweeping across the ranch that had been his life's work. The buildings stood solid against the darkening sky, the fields stretched fertile and productive in every direction, and inside the house that had once echoed with loneliness, the voices of his children created a symphony of belonging. Margaret returned to his side after settling the youngest ones, her hand finding his with the ease of long familiarity. "A penny for your thoughts, Mr. Reed." "Just thinking about journeys," he replied, drawing her close. "How sometimes the most important ones aren't measured in miles, but in the distance between two hearts." "Poetic for a cowboy," she teased gently. "I've had a good teacher." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Margaret Reed. More with each passing day." "And I love you." Her voice held the certainty of a promise kept, a journey completed, and a life well lived together. "My cowboy who made me his wife and the mother of his daughters." As night settled fully over Whispering Pines Ranch, the stars emerged one by one above the home they had built not just of wood and stone, but of love, sacrifice, and the shared belief that even in the untamed wilderness of the West, two hearts could find their way to each other and create something that would endure for generations to come.